My name's Dan Strange. I'm the director of Crosslands Forum, and I'm joined today by my good friend Pete Williams, who is the principal of Tyndale House in Cambridge. And Pete, we're going to chat about a parable of Jesus that's related to some work you've been doing on the way that Jesus was teaching. And we're going to look at that very famous parable, the parable of the lost son, the elder son, the two sons from Luke 15. Can you tell us what are some of the ways in which that teaching of Jesus reveals that he was just a genius teacher?
Yep. So the parable of the two sons, as I would prefer to call it, but usually known as the parable of the prodigal son, it is Jesus' longest story. It's only about 3 minutes long, so it's still pretty short, but it has lots of levels of storyteller's art. So it's got very good word choice in the story. Every single word counts, and a huge economy of words. So it starts with the younger son asking his father, "Father, give me a share of the inheritance." Every single time in the parable when he speaks, addressing his father, whether it's in his mind or actually, he calls him father. And the older brother, when he talks to his dad at the end, he says, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you." So it's the absence of the word there, which is a really brilliant element in the story. A couple of other absences that you have are the absence really of going into detail as to how the younger son wasted the money. It's just really dealt with one word, which is an adverb, which we might translate riotously or wantonly or whatever it is. It doesn't go into the details of sin because that doesn't make a story more interesting. So it's almost a completely different way of telling the story from almost any film about the story, which tends to make that, the prodigality, the main point. And then I think there's a sort of Sudoku principle in it, where you've got two preceding stories. You've got the story of the lost sheep, which is lost by going away, and the lost coin, which is lost at home. That then leads to a story of a son lost going away and a son lost at home. And each time preceding, there's been joy when the son is found. And then the story ends without telling you what happens with the older brother, but therefore implying that if he would come to his father and be reconciled, that there would be joy. So just those absences are a brilliant part of the story. Word choices like talking about the younger son joining himself to a citizen of the country he's gone to. Again, a brilliant word choice because it's an exclusionary term. He's not a citizen. The use in the story of, it says there's a great famine that happened in the one land which the younger son had decided to go to. That's an amazing thing because it means that when he gets to be feeding the pigs, it's in large part his own fault, but not entirely. There's actually this element that he's been at fault and also unlucky. And so in that way, one could have some compassion towards him in the sense that the older brother simply doesn't. The older brother, as far as he's concerned, it's entirely his fault. So those are just some of the storytelling aspects of the way Jesus tells things that are very powerful.
That's incredible. For this parable, obviously, Jesus was talking to a particular audience. Can you tell us about who we think the audience is, and how do you see him engaging with that audience during the teaching?
Yeah, so Luke says that there are 4 groups of people that are being addressed. So you've got tax collectors and sinners, and scribes and Pharisees. So tax collectors are people collaborating with the Romans to take people's money. Sinners are presumably people who are somewhat notorious for their sin, and sin's a pretty regular feature of their identity in life. Pharisees are people who are identified by separating from sin, and scribes are people who copy out the scriptures. So you would have thought that the scribes and the Pharisees know the Bible pretty well, tax collectors and sinners not so well. And Jesus tells this story that works brilliantly if you're a sinner running away from God, because the first 62% about the younger son just tells you, come back, and there's going to be this warm welcome. Then you've got the final 38% about the older brother, which really hits the scribes, because the dramatic high point of the story, what you would make, the music would go up at a film at this point, would be the father running, embracing, and kissing his son. And this actually coincides with a point of scribal knowledge and training. There's only one place in the Bible where the three verbs, someone ran, embraced, and kissed someone. And that's in Genesis 33, verse 4, when the Esau, who is an older brother, who's been cheated out of his inheritance by his younger brother, runs, embraces, and kisses his younger brother Jacob. And you are not expecting that at all in the Bible. It's a very surprising turn of events. And so even Esau, who's been cheated out of his inheritance, is prepared to forgive his younger brother. Now, if you think about the audience, if you're a Pharisee, you're having to pay tax to tax collectors. They may have ripped you off sometime. You're pretty annoyed at them. And the thought that they might be able to approach Jesus and therefore get close to God, that's a pretty annoying thought. So the Pharisees really need to forgive the tax collectors. And here we have this wonderful story of the father forgiving his son who's wasted his money, just as bad guy Esau in the Old Testament forgave his brother who had ripped him out of everything. Yeah. So I think there are those sort of points that are very powerful.
And do you think that Old Testament context is that the Esau story is the main kind of reference that we're to be thinking back to?
I actually think that the story works basically across all of Genesis's greatest hits. I mean, all of the major stories in Genesis. So let me just, the story starts, a man had two sons. Now, if you're thinking from an Old Testament perspective, as a scribe, someone who copies the Bible, what does that trigger? A man had two sons. Well, Genesis has got three famous stories where a man has two sons. So if I try this with a modern audience who knows the Bible somewhat, they'll often say Adam having Cain and Abel, or they might say Abraham having Isaac and Ishmael, or the most accurate is Isaac who has Esau and Jacob, because Isaac's the most famous person to have two and only two sons. But each one of those stories fits with this story of Jesus, because the story of Cain and Abel is the story of the older brother, envious of the younger brother being accepted by God. Younger brother, of course, they're associated with tending of animals, like we have in Jesus' story. The story of Abraham having Isaac and Ishmael, well, there's a big link there, because Abraham's the only other old guy in the Bible to run. The very first thing he does when he runs in Genesis chapter 18 is the first words from his mouth are the word quick, because he's ordering food very quickly for these three guests. He then gets a fatted calf ready. That's exactly what happens in Jesus' story. The old man runs, says quick, and quick the fatted calf. But also, Abraham's the only person in the Old Testament who gives away his inheritance while he's still alive. And this is a stunning thing, but he doesn't divide it equally between the brothers. The older brother gets nothing. Why does the older brother Ishmael get nothing? Because he's despised the feast for the younger brother. And that's actually the point in Genesis' story where he loses the inheritance. Then you get the story of Jacob and Esau. And of course, there you've got lots of similarities, probably the biggest cluster of similarities, everything from the younger brother saying, "Here I am dying of hunger," which is basically words taken from Esau's mouth when he comes in from the field, starving, wanting Jacob's soup. And that's the point at which he sells his birthright. There are so many other aspects. The only other time that you have goat taken as a meal, which is what the older brother says he wants. A young goat is in the story of Jacob tricking his father Isaac, who can't see afar off, wearing his brother's robe, and so on. But it's also the story of Joseph as well, later in Genesis, where Joseph is the son who is dead and alive again. That's and he also, you've got the ring and the robe, which is suddenly put on the prodigal son, which is just, there's an echo there of Genesis 41 verse 42, where you've got the ring and robe suddenly put on Joseph, who's the only other really instant, permanent rags to riches story you've got in the Bible.
And do you think that as the audience are listening to this, given their background and knowledge, that these associations are just kind of going off?
They may or may not. So I don't think Jesus is talking in a way that equates this and that. I think it's a way that shows real depth. I think it's possible to listen to Jesus and be underwhelmed and not to notice this, because he begins his stories, let the one who has ears to hear, giving you the clear possibility that you might not decide not to listen carefully and you might not notice it. But if you really wish to attend and you're seeking God, you'll find that. And I think, again, as at the cross, people can be deeply underwhelmed by Jesus' display of being Messiah, and yet that is the point when God's displaying his glory. I think God's glory is displayed in this story, the brilliance of it, with one really remarkable reference to the Old Testament every 20 seconds, and yet it's a very coherent story. And so you have that going on. But yes, people might not spot it and not be so impressed.
So there's obviously the genius of Jesus' teaching, but what do you think we can learn from how Jesus taught, given that we're not Jesus? Do you think this should affect the way that we teach and preach?
Yeah, I think there are so many levels of this. Firstly, Jesus studied the scriptures very carefully, knew them, he's bringing them out. Very scripturally based. He tells stories, and that's very memorable. He doesn't wear his learning on his sleeve. I mean, some people come along and they want you to know that they're intelligent. They sort of display it all. And I think what you've got here is a quiet genius. I remember someone once describing J.I. Packer as this person who knew such a lot, but you had to sort of like open the door and you get a new area of his knowledge, whereas other people really want to show off very quickly how much they know. So I think that's a lesson for us. He teaches with a simplicity. And so, I mean, I don't think this is necessarily something we can imitate, but he's got this amazing ability to teach simple people and learned people simultaneously. And this is, that is real genius.
But the layers you're bringing out from this could be a Sunday school talk at a very quite superficial, simplistic level, down to some of the allusions in the Old Testament, the theological.
That's right.
There's the depth of both, isn't there? That's incredible.
Yeah. So, and I think the other thing it teaches us is go back and look at those stories that you may have looked at for years and years, and expect there to be great depth in Jesus' teaching. And Jesus said so many very profound but short things, like the golden rule, do unto others what you have them do to you, or render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God, judge not, you be not judged. These are very, very profound sayings, and yet incredibly simple. And I think there is this thing that when you really understand the subject, you can simplify it. And of course, Jesus, as the Word of God incarnate, he has the greatest possible understanding, and therefore the greatest ability to simplify and communicate. I mean, as in he is the best communicator ever.
I wanted to change track a little bit here. Do you think there's a significant gap between the words of Jesus we have in the Gospels and what Jesus actually said? So the question, I suppose, is, was Jesus teaching in Greek, or were his words translated?
Well, I'll take both of those. To start with, I don't think there's a big gap between what you have in the Gospels and what Jesus actually said. And there are various reasons for this. And it's actually in a book I've got coming out called The Surprising Genius of Jesus. But one of the things is, of course, you don't make up great stories by committee. Like you can't make great poems by committee or whatever. This shows one mind. Secondly, I think that we've got to remember that all four Gospels present Jesus as repeating himself, that every single one of them has some things that are said twice at least in that Gospel. So once you have a really good piece of teaching, you reuse it. I mean, I certainly reuse talks all the time. And he also has these 12 students, disciples. That's their job, is to learn what he says. So therefore, a story like that, it's not that people have to memorize a 3-minute story on the spot. It's rather that they have heard it repeated. They may even have been taught it verbatim. Now, how exactly it got into Luke 15, there are various possibilities. I don't think we need to determine that. I think you can be very confident that all the hallmarks of Jesus are in that. So there are then features in the story which fit very well with other things we know of Jesus. So, for instance, over in Matthew's Gospel, you've got this saying about not throwing your pearls before swine or casting your treasure to the dogs, and you've got the pigs and the dogs next door to each other. In the same saying, in Luke 15 and 16, you have a story where it says that the younger son longed to be filled with the things that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. And then the very next chapter, we have Lazarus, the poor man, longing to be filled with the things that fell from the rich man's table, and along come the dogs and licked his sores. So you seem to have the same mind, the same phrase behind these two, and the pigs and the dogs coming together. And it's those sorts of features that you have, one's in Luke's Gospel, one's in Matthew's Gospel, that most parsimonious explanation is that they go back to someone who's not Matthew, not Luke, but someone before that. There are then aspects of a Palestinian rabbi that we can say. I mean, firstly, parables are specifically, especially Palestinian, and they come from a particular land. You can see in the warm-up stories, the lost sheep is also in Matthew's Gospel, and it has one sheep lost out of 100. We know rabbis often use 99 and 1 as a key thing. The lost coin has 1 out of 10 coins lost, and there's actually a rabbinic story about the losing the law being like losing a coin. And so it's actually a very, very powerful point, but again, it comes from this particular land. Now, the thought that Luke, who may be probably a Gentile, comes up with this sort of story, has the background knowledge to do this, just doesn't really make sense. So you get all of these things coming together, and if you were to try and establish what's the likely personal profile for someone coming up with a story of two sons and the surrounding stories, all of which interlink, then it comes pretty closely to, it has to be an absolutely brilliant Jewish storyteller from Palestine, and you also have some of the same sorts of features in the story as you get elsewhere. So this story ends with the father saying it was necessary to celebrate. Well, this is the way that Jesus ends others of his stories, whether it's necessary. So all of these features point to one particular person, and the whole lot coming from Jesus. Now, more briefly on the subject of language,
yes.
I think Jesus did teach sometimes in Greek and sometimes in Aramaic. It's hard to be sure of the proportion. Certainly with what's called the Sermon on the Mount, right before it describes there in Matthew chapter 4 the various places people came from, and one of them is the Decapolis, which are very Greek cities. So to communicate with them, it would make sense. There's no reason why he shouldn't be able to speak Greek. I mean, he has 2 of his 12 disciples, Andreas, Andrew, and Philip, have clearly Greek names. Greek is used. So I don't think there's any reason why that couldn't happen. But ultimately, it doesn't depend on a particular theory of the language Jesus used. If he's repeating these talks, there are multiple ways of getting absolutely reliable records of what Jesus said in the Gospels. It doesn't come through a thin channel. I think that there are thick channels, plenty of ways that story can be handed down. But certainly, when you look at the story, it's a work of art as a whole. It has to come from one person.
So it doesn't matter what language used in the teachings we've recorded in the Gospels, or does it?
No, and I think, the other thing is Aramaic and Greek are different language groups, but because since Alexander the Great, there's been a huge influence of Greek on the Eastern Roman Empire, even in Aramaic, you were often throwing in Greek words. So when it says there was, the older brother came back and there was music, and the Greek word is symphonia, that word existed in Aramaic as well. It had been loaned from Greek into Aramaic. So even some of the very words can come through that way. But yes, I don't see any problem with this being a really close mapping of what Jesus said. And if we explain the data best if we also accept Luke's own account of the audience, because it makes sense that you'd have this story with multiple layers if you really have the scholars in the audience that Luke says were in the audience. Yeah. Otherwise, why would they be there? Yeah. So I think everything holds together.
And finally, you mentioned that this particular exposition, or your understanding of the genius of Jesus' teaching in Luke 15, is part of a bigger work, a bigger book. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, it's quite a short work, 35,000 words, called The Surprising Genius of Jesus, coming out October 2023 with Crossway. And yeah, I'm excited about that. And it's looking just at this aspect of Jesus we often don't think about, which is how measurably clever his teachings are.
And what other parables or stories have you included?
So we'll look at the story of the temporarily rich man and Lazarus, or might be called the rich man and Lazarus as another example, and a lot of the shorter stories. So rattle through them, but there are lots of examples of Old Testament echoes in Jesus' stories.
Thanks, Pete. Great to hear about this parable and the upcoming book.